girl, but growing.
Today is May 23rd of 2008. This is an interview with Shirley Athay about the time she spent in Stanley, Idaho during the 1930s. Shirley, my first question for you is, what brought you to Stanley?
Yes, hello. My father, Preston Linford, was a civil engineer for the Bureau of Public Roads, which is now called the Department of Transportation, and he was a surveyor and construction engineer, and they were working in Idaho, up in Gibbonsville, and they had finished that project, and we learned the next spring, the spring of 1929, that we had to break camp and go to Stanley.
How long were you there for?
My father and his family, my mother, brother, and I were there from 1929, the summer. It probably was May, after school was out for my brother, to 7 years, 6 years later, what would that be? 1935. I was 5 years old when we arrived, and the last summer I spent was my 11th year. So I really spent a great deal of years as a little girl, but growing up, and it was wonderful.
Now, were you there all year long, or were you only there in the summertime?
Yes, due to construction, my father usually left, Ogden to go to select his crew and to get in touch with the contractors and so forth, and he would leave in May, and then after school was out, possibly the last of May, he came to Ogden and picked us up with all of our belongings, which I will tell you later about, and we went to Stanley for the first time. I was 5 years old, and we were so excited because we had been to Ketchum and gone over the summit. My father had worked on the roads from Haley up to Ketchum years before, and when we saw the mountains, the valley, we were so excited, and we could hardly wait to get to Stanley and get out of the car and play. And when we turned up the street, the road to Stanley, from the lower Stanley, it looked so barren. We said, where are the homes? No homes. Where are the people? No people. We came to a halt, and my father said, here we are. My brother and I looked at each other, and there wasn't anything else, and we both said together, where are the children? Well, that's a story a little later. We were propped in front of a wood, a frame, not even really a cabin. It looks like more of a tent style building. 2 rooms, and one big room with a partition between. Well, our faces just dropped, and we both ran into the street calling names for children. Where are you? Well, finally, 3 young children came forth from this big building, which later learned was the local store, general store, and their name was Gillespie, and the oldest girl, my brother's age at that time, would have been, 7, and then another daughter, my age, and then a little boy, Jack. So there was Gertrude, Doris, and little Jack. And that was the children. Those were the children of Stanley that we enjoyed for all those summers. And they were rioting years.
Shirley, tell me what your house looked like inside and out.
Well, Adrienne, I mentioned that it was kind of like a tent. Wood frame around it, but it seemed to be a tent. We had one large room inside with a partition, and in the front, as you go into the house from the road, was one bookcase about 3 feet by 3 by depth of 12 for our toys and books, and there was one chair and one cot. Then in the next room was, in the corner, was a huge black stove, iron stove, and a cupboard, and then a stand with a wash basin and a pitcher, a mirror above it, and a potty underneath. And then there was a table with 4 chairs, wooden chairs, very primitive, and a big double bed, a double cot. And a few years later, they built a screen about 4 feet away from the house, and from the back door around. We had no water, running water at all. There was a pump, about 10 feet away, and of course our lavatory was so-called a wood shed, as they're called, an outhouse, as they say. And in fact, a two-holer. Well, anyway, it was quite a shock to us, because in Ogden, we had a very lovely home. Well, then next to us was the office of my father, with the young draftsman and his men that he chose to work with the construction people, and they were lovely young men. In fact, it was exciting because several years after being there, 2 of them married and brought their wives to Stanley, of all places. And of course, that was wonderful for me, because they were in their early 20s, and I kept house for them, and then they gave me their clothes to dress up. We had such fun. And now, as I said, there wasn't very much in Stanley, but they had built several cabins across the road and behind the general store, where these 2 young couples lived. So it was very exciting for me. But as I said, no running water, so all the water had to be heated on the stove. My mother had no ironing board. She used the table, and then she had a iron. Oh, that was scary and hot. And so washing dishes or washing clothes, we always had water there.
Can you tell me what your stove looked like and how you guys were able to cook your food?
I think in museums they have these old iron stoves. There was a four burner with a big oven, and it had a kind of a vent on the top, and it was put in a corner so that mother could move around a bit. And that was our means of cooking. Now, that's another story. What they cooked and what we had to eat. You see, we had no refrigerator at all, so everything was prepared that day.
Can you tell me what kind of food that they had in the stores that you could buy?
If I remember correctly, it was not a grocery store like we have today, or even a semblance of it. It was mostly candy and nuts and pop, and cigarettes. I'll tell you a story about that later. I'm sure provisions like wheat or flour, because my mother baked all of our bread and pies, not cakes, and I don't ever recall going over to Mr. Gillespie and buying meat. We had lots of chicken, and of course my mother had to kill the chicken. And that was something, to wring the neck and then defeather them and burn it, and then cut it up and clean it out. My brother, to his dying day, would never eat dark meat, chicken, because he had to clean the chickens. And it was quite an experience. And so we had lots of potatoes, and I know for some reason my father always had a good breakfast, because of course he was a construction engineer and out on the job, and I'm sure we had eggs and bacon and homemade bread toasted. And dinners, I know that they were wonderful, because I, of course, was a chubby little girl and enjoyed all the goodies. Mother made tremendous pies, and so I think the fruit came from canned fruit only. And in the summertime, I recall about once a year in the summer, a truck would come, and they would have fresh produce, or apples, or so forth. But the general store, we could buy canned weenies, little Vienna sausages, and I remember Fig Newtons. That was, and pop. And our pop was cream soda, root beer, orange crush. We didn't have Coke. I never remember Coke at all. And but we always had great food, so we must have gotten meat, but I never remember a steak or a roast, but lots of chicken. And then, of course, in the summer time, when the fishing was on, we had wonderful trout. My father would come home from the work, change his boots, and get his tackle, and away he went, and in an hour he would be back with the most beautiful rainbow trout, and he had cleaned them, and Mother had the potatoes and onion and bacon cooking, and we'd have lots of trout in the summertime, and homemade biscuits. So and on our picnics, we had lots of lovely summer picnics, particularly up at Redfish Lake. They have this lovely picnic area. We would have potato salads and different salads, but no fresh lettuce or anything like that, but homemade ice cream. Now, how did we get the ice cream? Well, Mr. Gillespie's store had a very high roof, maybe 2 or 3 stories, and you climbed a ladder and went to the first level, and you would see these huge icebergs covered with sawdust. And when you wanted ice, you went over and asked him to go up and chip it off, and you get it, and you made your ice cream. Or if you couldn't get to a watermelon, that was one thing. I don't know how that came about. I think they grew them, but on a picnic, we put them in the lake to cool. But if you ever wanted ice, you had to, of course, buy it. But in the wintertime, you see, the lakes were frozen, so they hauled these gigantic pieces of ice, and he stored them.
It sounds like, as a chef in today's world, we take a lot of things for granted. So you were talking about the two brides that got to come into town. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the other locals that live there?
I'd be happy to. In our little area, as I said, it was the Gillespies. And Mrs. Gillespie was the only woman in Stanley as to have my mother, that they were friends. And that was wonderful, thank goodness. And Mrs. Gillespie had a great sense of humor, and my mother, and so it really kept her summers better, indeed. Then there were no other people except Juggy and Trapper Green, who were old-timers that had come there in youth from the East, I suppose, to mend their broken hearts or search for great wealth. And Juggy was the gas station attendant. He had one pump and a little tiny shack, and we called him Juggy because he was always just a little bit on the front side with a kind of like the reindeer with the red nose, and Happy and Juggy. Juggy was short, maybe 5'8", and then Trapper Green was a tall, handsome, about 6 feet, very muscular man, and he did do a lot of trapping, and he had a little cabin there, so we had them. Then later, a few years later, after us being there at first, they built 2 rooms. I call them buildings, 2 buildings, but they were just like 2 rooms, and it became a cafe. And so you would have, on occasion, the ranchers would come into town to get some supplies, I'm sure, particularly cigarettes, because that was very popular diversion. And we would see them, but we never saw ladies except on Saturday night dance.
The Saturday night dance sounds like a lot of fun. Can you tell me a little bit more about what the dances consisted of?
The dance hall was across the street on the same corner, the opposite corner of the grocery store, and it was an old building that was beautifully, at one time, constructed, had a wonderful stage, and a wonderful dance floor, polished and gorgeous, and I can't remember really if it was once a week or once a month they had the dances. And of course they had a violin and a piano and I think a horn. And they were the good old songs of that time and the dancing. And it was lots of fun. And particularly for Doris and Gertrude and my brother and I, because Sunday morning, instead of going to church because there was not a church there, we would go over and pick up empty whiskey bottles. And then we would take them to the store where a man would pay us for them. And that's the way we earned our next fall's spending money. But they also played wonderful waltzes, and I believe it was my last summer there at age 11 where my father finally said that we could go over to the dance. And I remember that they had tables around, a few tables, where people sat and enjoyed their drinks, and my father invited me to dance and taught me how to waltz. And I was the star of the evening. Mr. Linford's daughter was dancing the waltz, because I was very important because of Mr. Linford. But it was a wonderful experience.
So with all you kids running around, did you get any schooling? Was there a school up there, and what was that like?
In the summertime, of course, there was no school, but they did have a schoolhouse, quite old, dilapidated. Now, since my father's work concluded generally by the late September, sometimes he stayed until October, he took us back to Ogden for my brother and I to attend school in Ogden. But there was a schoolhouse there, and one fall, my father said, I won't be very long, about a month, and he said, the weather's going to be good, won't you stay? And then we'll go home together. And we said, oh, we have to go to school. So it just happened that next door to us on the right was built a home, and a lovely lady arrived, and she was the school teacher. Well, I liked her because that was fun. And so we found out about school, and I entered the first grade at Stanley, and my brother was in the third. But he was doing sixth grade work. He was so brilliant. But anyway, it was quite exciting because there were children from all over the area, and there were, I think, about only 10 of us. There were 3 brothers that lived on a huge ranch across the, I call it prairie, to the west of us. And they never came into town, and so it was interesting to meet a few other children. But we stayed only for 1 month. And the teacher was very good, of course, all those grades in one class. But my mother had been a school teacher and taught in a rural school outside of Twin Falls. So she appreciated what this lovely lady had to do. And it so happened that I became very ill with quinsy, and they almost took me to Ketchum to the hospital. But luckily, I was okay after a while, and she came in every night and talked to me and did my lessons with me. So she was a lovely lady, and in fact their house had running water, and we were so envious of her. And the children, there was a school bell, and you had to behave properly. We had recess, and we all brought our lunches, and played games and got mad at each other and threw mud pies at each other, but all in all, it was a wonderful experience.
Shirley, can you tell me why people would come to visit? Were people traveling up there, and what kind of accommodations were there for them to stay in?
Stanley, to me, was not a resort area. It seemed to me that people were going through there, going to other places, like to Montana, to going on up to Salmon City, or going to Ketchum. And coming from Boise, there was a beautiful drive from Boise over through an old mining town called Idaho City, and then this marvelous fields called Bear Valley, and that was something that I do recall that I had heard from people living in Boise that was a summer trip to go through once a month to see the different flowers that bloomed. And as far as, well, the lakes were beautiful. People liked to fish. There were no hotels. There was a small cabin or two down in Lower Stanley on the river, but we never stayed there. And then, of course, the famous Redfish Lake was their lodge, and that finally developed to much larger accommodations. So there were no motels, no fancy restaurants, no, well, there were places for people to camp. We have friends here. My husband is an artist, and he has friends who are artists. And one summer when we were there, we went to this one area, and they are great campers. So they lived in a tent and so forth. Up, I think it was in Redfish Lake area. But this other summer that we went to paint, they lived further away, and so there were people who camped. Now also, there was a great coming and going for sheep. So in the summer, midsummer usually, if I remember correctly, the sheep herders would bring their sheep through, and of course they would stay in Stanley down by the river. And that was kind of exciting because that was new people coming in that stayed there so you could talk to them. And we had great fun, enjoying, in fact, lovely lamb dinners, and saw their inside of their cabins and learned how very wonderful people these are, taking care of their sheep. And one summer, this nice sheep herder presented me with a little lamb as a pet. And that was quite exciting. And in fact, we used it not used it. My pet became a stage star. That's a story later. Anyway, so as far as coming, I think that mostly people coming through, or they did have, and probably still do, these great ranches of beautiful old cabin homes that the wealthy would come out and spend the summer. I became acquainted with two ladies that lived in Chicago, and they owned this tremendous ranch. And that's when they would come into Stanley to buy their cigarettes. They were ladies of great culture, but when they were there, they were in dirty jeans, boots, no makeup, sloppy hair. But when I was invited to tea in their living room, it was elegant, and you had to really have manners. But that was a lovely experience. They were wonderful people. And
so when people weren't working, what kind of things did you like to do for fun? What different activities did you do up there?
we had no TV, no telephone, no radio. Well, we did have a telephone. My father had, because of his position, but we couldn't use it. So we had our books and toys and games that were packed and brought there from Ogden. And then we had time to make up our own experiences. We would travel mostly, around with our own legs. We'd take a afternoon or a morning to afternoon walk up to Stanley Lake and have our picnic and come back, or we would go hunting for Indian arrow heads in the sagebrush, and that was very dangerous because of the wood ticks. So any time that we were out on such adventure, after dinner I was stripped, laid on the kitchen table, and my father went over with my body with a flashlight and tweezers and matches, of all things, and he would pick out the
of what they did for fun.
Since we weren't in the big city to do things, we had to make up our own games and so forth. Well, it was wide open spaces for us. We'd get our long overalls on and our little hiking shoes and staff, and away we'd go someplace around the area of Stanley. And one time we got able to ride horses. There was a man that would come in to buy provisions at the local store, and he got acquainted with us, and we were very excited about being around horses. And so one day he brought in 3 horses, and of course we rode bareback of all things, but I really learned to get on and off with help, of course, but it was fun. I learned to trot, and we had that several times, but that wasn't a daily experience, but a wonderful one. And then Trapper Green was very good, and I mentioned him a long time ago, and he had a little log cabin that was his home, and one day he asked me if I'd like to have his cabin as my playhouse, and I didn't know if I should. Of course, with my mother's permission and looking things over, Mother said that will be all right. Well, it was a very nice experience. The cabin was of the old logs, 1 room, and it had a bed in it, and then a chair and a table, a very small table with 1 chair, and a cupboard, and a counter, and a little sink. No running water, but at least a sink. He had pots and pans and dishes, and there were 2 windows. Well, I decided to just be a little housekeeper and just would straighten up and had my own tea parties with my imaginary friends, and it was lots of fun. I spent 2 or 3 hours there, and that was enough. And it was fun to be alone, and yet you wanted other people around too. So off I'd trot home. And of course it was always more fun to work someplace else than helping my mother, who needed help. Well, and then we kids were always getting into kind of imagination and fun. We got together, and of course my brother was the big shot and the most brilliant of us, but he was quite a thespian, and in later life he was at the university a very fine actor in Shakespeare and so forth. But anyway, he said, let's put on a play. So I do not remember the subject at all, but we had our lines and a story to go along with it. And at the time, I was given a little baby lamb, maybe 3 or 4 months old, by one of the sheep herders that was very nice. I think I mentioned the sheep herders and how fun we had going down and visiting them, and then we'd get to be around the sheep, and they always provided us with fresh meat to take home to my folks, which was very, very nice. Well, anyway, I was thrilled to get this little lamb, and it was really a lovely little pet around our cabin, or 2x4, and so we decided to incorporate this very bright little animal into our play. And of course, it being my pet, it obeyed me. It would not obey anybody else. So we rehearsed everything very nicely, and she did very well when she was called and so forth. Well, the night of the performance, which was sold out, in fact, and we don't know where the people came from, really, because we never saw them in the daytime. I would say there were 100 people there. We had the first act just beautifully done, and I remember along the second act, that was where the little Lammy took over, and she wouldn't budge. She wouldn't do a thing. And I'd coax her, and she wouldn't do a thing. My brother, loud-voiced, coaxed her, had a slap on the rear end from him. That didn't help at all. So when she was cuddled and talked to, put down, and all of a sudden, bang, across the stage and out of the whole auditorium in a jiffy. Well, of course, I stood there stunned and made a bow. I'll never forget that. So people clapped and clapped like that was supposed to be in the play. But it was a fun experience. We didn't put on any more plays after that. But it took up quite a few days of activity. Then, we like to go down around the little stream. I think it's an outlet from Stanley Lake, and it's to the north of Stanley in the little creek. Is it still there? And we'd go down there, and my brother and little Jack would have a play fishing pole to try to catch minnows and such, and we girls would just walk around and pretend we were glamour girls and so forth. And then one day, Gertrude, the oldest daughter of the store owner, brought about 6 packs of cigarettes. And of course at that time everybody was smoking. In the 30s, everybody smoked, except my mother. My father smoked cigars, and I'll tell you about that story later. But anyway, we had to learn. This was the thing to do. And of course, we had no movies there, but we did get movie magazines and so forth to show these people with their fancy cigarettes and holding them and having a drink or so forth. So we pretended, but we smoked and tried them all. Well, and we did that several times. It's strange that the father didn't find out that his packages of cigarettes were missing. However, one day I got very ill from it. I had a tummy ache and a headache, and I said, I'm going home. And I was not well liked at that moment, that I'm a sissy. And to stay with it is fun. And because we tried each pack, like the Camels, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, and so forth, Philip Morris. Well, anyway, but I did. I left and went home, and my mother said, well, you don't look very good, Shirley. What's the matter? Oh, I just don't feel good. And she smelled the smoke, and she said, what's going on? And I told her. I let out the cat. Well, she was pleased that I told her, because she said that I was sick from the inhalation and so forth. And so we were caught. I don't know the punishment that the Gillespie children had, but my dad gave us a good talking to. No spats that night or anything, but a good talking to. And after that, we didn't go into the store, and we didn't have any cigarettes, but we had a heck of a good time trying out all of them. And in fact, most of them liked Lucky Strikes the best, because they seemed to be the strongest. I preferred Chesterfields. They seemed to be a lighter cigarette at that time. So, quite an experience. Then, we didn't have holidays up there, of course, except the 4th of July. And one day, my father, which he always did early in the morning, go to work in his usual butterfly pants and great boots and hat and shirt. Well, anyway, he came home with quite a few packages, and that was strange because there weren't any stores around for us. So on the 4th of July, we were kind of sad, my brother and I, because in Ogden we had great fireworks in the park, and we had our own little street of fun fireworks. Well, that evening my father said, "Now I want you to look over that mountain at such and such a time." "Oh, what do we want to look over there for? Goodness sake. Let's go find the kids and play ball." Well, all of a sudden, out of the mountain were brilliant sky rockets, colorful, all kinds of wonderful fireworks, and colorful, showing off all the valley. And then pretty soon, everybody who was in Stanley at that time, I still say there were maybe 10 people, but we're in the street clapping, and we were singing "God Bless America" and all of these songs, and trying to sing the "America the Beautiful" and so forth, and "Yankee Doodle Dandy," of course. But we had a good time, thanks to my father. He had gone up early, climbed the mountain, set everything up in his very scientific way, the engineering way, in circles and in straight forms and so forth. So the whole city was very pleased with it. And I think I understand now that they still have this experience every year. But my father started it. Mr. Linford started it. But anyway, that was fun for us. Now, for Adrian asked me about why did people come there, and I was not thinking very well, because, of course, they came for the mountains. There was, at that time, built a dude ranch near Alturas Lake. It was you entered it in an old frame gate, and as you entered in to the right were about a half a dozen cabins connected, wood cabins connected, with the prettiest white curtains in their window. And these were similar to what we have today now as motels. And then you walked quite a ways down, and there were 3 pools, beautiful swimming pools. There was the tennis court, several courts, but I remember the tennis court because people were playing then. Then you walked further, and there was the section for the horses, these corrals, and dogs, and I saw lots and lots of package of equipment. And I learned that this was where they called them the dudes, the wealthy people from the world stayed. And they had a massage parlor there, and a dietitian, and all of this fancy living. But people came there also to climb the great Sawtooth Mountains. They came from all over the world. I remember this one man talking to several of us that they were the Sawtooth were the hardest mountains, most difficult mountains that he had ever tried to climb. More difficult than the Swiss Alps. But he said they were also the most beautiful because of the many lakes that you see and the experience of the growth, the wild flowers and so forth. So that was the mainstay there. And I suppose that's where some of the fancy pickups came into Stanley to buy their cigarettes. And across from the dude ranch was a huge farm, and it was owned by a family named Williams. And I don't know how I became acquainted with the daughter of the owner, but maybe the few school days that I attended there, or if she came in with her father to buy provisions at the store. But she invited me to come up and stay one weekend. That was lovely. You climbed quite a ways up to get to the house because it was up on the hill, because down below was the great farm. And I was invited to ride on the haystacks and to ride the horses. That I did not do very well, so we played games instead. But then she had her bedroom on the second floor, and it seemed like it was close to heaven. And you could look out, and the stars were as bright and pretty as diamonds, and you could reach them. And the sky so blue. It certainly has changed these many years because of pollution, hasn't it? So, but that was lovely. But you had to go up at night. You still had to climb down the stairs and go outside to the outhouse, which wasn't very comfortable, but that's the way they lived. Well, I had a lovely weekend there. I only saw her one other time. Isn't that strange? However, I do understand that the Williams farm is still there, and I hope to see it. Or perhaps the Williams have already been contacted to talk about Stanley. I hope they have. Then, the other farm that was interesting was right down in Lower Stanley, across from the little store and gas station, and it was called the Woolley Farm. And I understand that some of the Woolleys are still there. I'm anxious to meet them. At that time, a middle-aged lady, and her daughter were the only inhabitants of the farm. Well, this daughter was just beautiful. She was tall. She was more like a Norwegian, beautiful blonde hair and long, thick braids, clear skin, blue eyes, nice figure. But she never was about. She never came out of that area. And however, we learned later, while I was still there, that somehow she met a man from Chicago and married, and that he was an extremely wealthy man. I haven't heard anything from the Gillespies because they're long gone now, but evidently it was true. It would be nice to know what happened to her. And then, as I said, the other farm, or ranch, the society gals called it, their ranch, was very beautiful. And so these were the people that mostly I had experiences with and became friends with. Now, there wasn't very much activity for fun for everybody, but in the summertime there was a rodeo. And not until I was old enough, because my father was very protective of me, did he take me to the rodeo, because you had to sit on a fence or stay in your car to see the rodeo. And they were real cowboys. And they had those old shirts with the kerchief tied around their neck, and were there bucking broncos. And some people were hurt. But it was quite exciting finally when I was old enough to go, because my brother used to tell me all about it. Because, of course, in Ogden, during the summer pioneer days, we call them, they do have rodeos, but they're more commercial kind. But this was the real thing, real wild horses trying to be tamed. So that was a big event for us.
Can you tell tell us what the weather was like?
Weather was quite unpredictable. In the summertime, of course, it was very hot because we lived more on the plateau. The upper Stanley is more on a plateau, and there's all this dry earth coming on the west side and around our area. Of course, we had no trees or no shrubs or no flowers in that little area. And, of course, away from it was all sagebrush. So we had these hot days and then these horrible winds, and they were fiercely blown, fierce and blew dirt. It was dirt. The windows would be covered, you couldn't see through them. And our little cabin, of course, was not very secure for protection, so that became quite a difficult situation to clean up after. So that would happen several times in the summertime. Then, on occasion, we would have these horrible rainstorms, lightning and torrential rain, and you'd think that your cabin was going to fall apart. But that did cool down things for a while. But you really couldn't tell. Otherwise, early fall was nice, and when we first came there in May and June, it was lovely weather. I don't ever remember of wearing a coat. Isn't that strange? Except up around Redfish Lake when we went up there in the late evening. And fortunately, I never had bad cancer problems on my skin because I didn't wear shirts all the time. We had these hats, but the weather was unbearable. And because of the very amount of heat that we had, forest fires were prevalent. And they would come very close. They would be on the east side of the river, however, and those mountains, or quite far away on the west side. And that smoke and the ashes in the morning, Mother again would say, well, we've got a sweep up to do, and opened up the back door, and the ashes were just about a half an inch thick all over. And again on the windows, and came inside our house. So again, you had to stay inside. And being inside, what could we do? Well, Doris, my friend, would come over, and at that time, we had the Sears catalog and the Montgomery Ward. And in those, they had paper doll sheets. So we would cut out the paper dolls and then go through and cut out the clothes that we were to put on these paper dolls and have paper dolls. Or we would play with my own little house that my father brought, my doll house, and we would read, play silly card games, but we couldn't go outside. My brother would just go sulk and read. But
tell us what kind of wildlife you saw.
Well, the wildlife I saw was a bear or two about once every summer tied up to a post down in Lower Stanley across from the little store. And I think it was more of a gimmick for people to stop and buy their gas there and their Cracker Jack or so forth. Well, so these were black bears, and they were mostly cubs. I never saw a large one. But around Stanley, no, I never saw any wildlife. And of course, the fish were, to me, wildlife. And of course, we saw salmon and trout. And it was a wonderful experience to see the returning of salmon from the ocean to come back to fawn, to these salmon, you probably know this story, they return when they are to spawn again, the birth of course. They travel all the way back from the ocean, and it was wonderful to see them come upstream. And then you would really watch a little family, how they would, it was kind of like sentinels. They care for their mother, and they go by her so that no other fish will come by and eat the eggs or hurt her in any way. So that was quite a lot of learning. And then, of course, the sad part was upstream they built a dam with and put nails on it and all kinds of rocks. I don't know how they held the rocks on, but these salmon had to get up over that little barricade. As water was coming down, they had to jump up and go over. But so many could not make it and would get caught in the nails and the debris. And then there would be these people on the side with their nets or their pole to go fish the fish off of the barricade. And that was very disheartening to us. My brother and I would cry out to them not to do that, let the fish go. And then they would show up this big salmon that they caught, the bullies. Oh, I don't know. It was very sad for us. But then also one of the pleasurable times to do was to go up to Redfish Lake in the evening. Several times, of course, one of the parents would take our gang, up there for a little picnic late in the day, and we could stay and watch the sunset, and they would go on the canoes across and have a good time. But for my brother and I, we enjoyed very much just seeing the beauty of the lake. And there was a dog there that loved to play. You'd play catch with him. Would throw out or bring back. Would throw out a piece of wood, and he'd go swim and bring it back to us. And that was lovely. Otherwise, we'd just stand and admire the beauty of the lake and the surroundings. And at that time, people were so respectful of the area and the lake. And 40 years ago, my husband and I returned to this area. I wished my daughter, who was 5, to see where I was when I was 5 years old, because she had heard so much about my life. And we stayed at Redfish Lake, and oh, it was terrible. We heard boom boxes and screaming and vulgar laughing, and it broke up my heart to see how disrespectful they were to this gorgeous nature that they were around. They were spoiling it. I don't know if that still occurs or not, but it was heartbreaking to me because it was so gorgeous and so quiet. No matter what your thoughts were or your problems, you could just go there and you were renewed from the beauty and the feeling of spirituality and the respect people had. I hope that has come back.
Now, in some of your pictures, you guys are wearing some interesting clothing. Can you tell me a little bit about what you guys wore?
I wore overalls. most of the time during the day to play, and because they, as you walk through the brush, so the ticks wouldn't get onto your legs, then sometimes a little shirt, a hat, and of course it was interesting. My mother still insisted on keeping starched, pretty little dresses that in case of we had to go someplace. Well, on occasion we did, and it was fun to dress up. But otherwise, you wore overalls, and so did the other girls. Or they'd wear shorts sometimes, but that wasn't in my class. And I was a little chubby girl, and so I stayed away from those as well. And you had to wear sturdy shoes because it was rocky. Now, in front of our little cabin, or 2x4 as I call it, we were right on the street, so it was dust constantly. So there again, you needed sturdy shoes to walk around, and of course, a heavier type if we were going to go walking to a lake or so forth. And as I said before, I don't remember wearing really a jacket at all, because we were
The reason why you guys were up there in the first place was because your father was building the roads and such. Can you tell us about the construction crew and how you got all the equipment up there and a little bit about that stuff?
Yes, that should be the total story, but I'm diverse because of my wonderful memory. Well, my father, as I said, was a civil engineer for the Bureau of Public Roads at that time, which is now called Department of Transportation. And he was sent out from the district office, which was located in Ogden. That would be Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. And in the wintertime, they did drawings, preparation or schematic drawings for where the roads would go, and very detailed, of course, because they had these surveyors go out years earlier, to find which is the best route and what the problems were to construct a highway. My father, as a young man, started in 1915 as a young surveyor and worked his way up. So he became, as I said, a construction engineer, but he was surveyor too. So then they planned all of what they would do, how many miles or the project would be for the months that the weather would permit construction. Well, the crew from the office would be my father, big boss, and of course an accountant, secretary to keep in touch with the main office, and an aide. Then there had to be bids taken by contractors. Now, at that time, the Morrison-Knudsen Company in Boise got the bid for this amount of highway construction. So they provided all of the equipment. That is the steam shovels, the trucks, the graters, and lots of the crew. And my father was the supervisor, of course, and they had the plans, but then his crew, my father's crew, had to set this up too. So then he was responsible for the building of it. The equipment was very interesting, of course, bringing over steel for the bridges. Well, of course, they had to use dynamite lots of times to cut out certain parts of the earth to provide for the road to be built. And then after that, you see, we had to carry away all the debris and refine it, or keep what they wanted to use as the layer for the road. Then there would be the grading, and then they would measure the amount of earth, because it must all be the same. So the equipment came from Boise, and a lot of the crew. Then, of course, the actual design was done by the office in Ogden, under the direction of my father. Then, even building of the bridges, I believe there are several pictures that I've given. I'm sorry they're not larger. I had some wonderful ones that the Bureau of Public Roads had taken, and a few years ago, since it was turned over to Department of Transportation, they went through all of these files, went way back and cleaned out files, because this was no longer a study. And we knew a person in that department, and he knew my father had worked on this project, so he brought me these marvelous pictures of the same that are in my little book, but very enlarged and framed. But the University of Utah learned about my father's work from 1915, and I had to write up his biography and history and give as much of his material as possible for it, and that's now turned over to the university. But it was very exciting to see the steam shovels, of course, picking up the earth and dumping it into these big trucks. Then, of course, I, being Mr. Linford's daughter, was very important. When my father permitted us to go with him to see some of the construction, which he didn't very often do, we were introduced to these operators and so forth. And one time, Mr. Knudsen was there, a very handsome man, I remember, looked a little bit like my father, very distinguished, and I was excited, and he asked me if I would like to work on one of the big trucks. And I said, oh, that would be fun to do. So he set me in the big chair, and of course he did it, the work, but I thought I did it, getting this big scooper, this steam shovel, to go way down, and oh, the noise, you can't believe it, deafening. Pick up the earth, and then you move it over and get it right into the truck. And they applauded me for my work, but that was Mr. Knudsen's. But my husband just told me that Morrison Knudsen, I think, went broke or out of business or something, is no longer. But it would be interesting if they had archives to know how many miles they had completed that year, because generally they set up that they had to complete so much. And I remember my father and one of his rare occasions when we were with him, speaking to them, and they had progressed or something, and he was a tough director, and boy, did they get on the ball. But I believe the bridges are still intact, and they were beautiful at that time. Going back to clothes, my father, of course, had been up and down the areas from Chalice, well, really Salmon City down, and of course I had to eat someplace. Mother never gave him a lunch. We don't know what happened, but anyway, he loved lemon meringue pie, and it so happened that he told us about this wonderful farm with this lady that's made lemon meringue pie, and had invited us as a family down some Sunday. Well, that's when I got dressed up. We were scrubbed from head to foot. I had the shiniest face and the cleanest hair and the prettiest starched dress. In those days you had puff sleeves and a little belt around you and kind of a full skirt. And my grandmother was a seamstress, and so I had really pretty clothes. And I had my Sunday shoes, of all things, to go to a farm. But her house, in this lady's home, she had one room with about 4 tables with the prettiest cloths and the prettiest clean curtains, which of course we could not have in Stanley. And we served dinner. And this wonderful lemon meringue pie she made especially for my father. And I was complimented on my pretty dress. So we did dress up once in a while, but normally it was play clothes. Adrienne, this has been a great experience for me. I think of Stanley so much, and I've had many experiences, and I have lived in Europe, I have lived in the East Coast, but Stanley was always in my mind for relaxation, comfort, good people, good living, and a beautiful childhood. And it has been quite an emotional retake for me, as now I am 84 years old, but it has also been a very wonderful experience, and I thank you for it.
Well, Shirley, thank you so much for your time and your memories. It's great to hear the history on a place that I've grown to love so much.
And he loved his work. I've never seen anybody so excited to go to work. And he did not retire until he was 72. And if you ride on I-15 down here in Utah and down in southern Utah through St. George, all that area, he was worked on the construction there on both of those and pre-planning. And he did a wonderful job and had many honors from the government. Now, there is one picture that I think represents his enthusiasm, that I say, there goes Dad, off to work, ready to go. He did not like sitting in the office and planning. He wanted to get out in the world, in the field. And he was so loving of his country and the animals. He told us that it was deer season and you could shoot a deer, so he took a rifle along, and this was over in Idaho City area. And this doe came up right close to him, and he said he could have popped her. And he said that animal looked in his eyes, and he said he couldn't harm an animal. But he was a great, respected person and an engineer and he did a great job. And in fact, he worked from Haley to Ketchum. Those were my father's jobs. And then from Ketchum over Galena, and then down into Stanley, and then worked from Chalice down to Stanley. So you go on those roads. And of course, one thing he always taught to respect the earth. And we'd come to the Galena summit and stop. And he would have us get out and go over and count all the little streams, the silver coming down from the great Sawtooth Mountains, to say, this is where the Salmon River begins. And then one year, I always wanted to follow the river to the ocean. And one year, my husband took me up on it, and we started in Stanley, and of course it starts up in Jackson too, in those great mountains. And then we followed it to the connection of each river into the Columbia, and then the Columbia, it was up in the Muckletale in Washington area, and then we crossed a bridge where we saw that this great body of water goes into the Pacific. And I was just so satisfied. I said, it was a wonderful experience, and to respect it. We must respect our earth and appreciate it. And I thank my father for all he did for my brother and me in learning about the beauty of the earth and how to care for it. We can build things on it, but don't destroy it.
Just a couple more things that Shirley wanted to add. What else did you guys do for fun as kids?
Well, since my father was a construction engineer, my brother decided that that's what we would do, that is, build roads. So we had a sand pile outside by the back door, and we built the roads, and we had the hills, and of course couldn't have dynamite, but we used matches. And then we didn't have the cranes to carry the steel across the river, of course, for the bridges, but we sure had a lot of fun. My brother, of course, was the chief civil engineer, and it was lots of fun. I thought you'd like to know what happened to the Linfords after Stanley. My mother was happy to be back in Ogden in her lovely little modern bungalow, and until my brother and I went away to college, she remained just a housewife, not just a housewife, a busy lady, and then she returned to teaching school and retired at 62 when my father retired at 72. They had a lovely sweetheart life. It was wonderful to see them in the wintertime dressing up very fancy. My mother looked so beautiful with her special evening dress, it was called, not gown. And my father in his beautiful blue navy suit and his maroon polka dot tie, and they headed for Salt Lake City to the Capitol to attend the Hotel Utah for the big contractors ball they had each year. They were certainly sweethearts. Then my brother followed my father's footsteps and went to the University of Utah and graduated in civil engineering, after which the war called him to the Navy. He served in the Pacific Ocean Theater as a second lieutenant, and after the war he entered the University at Ann Arbor, Michigan, and worked until he received a master's degree in civil engineering. And on his thesis, it was the highest they ever presented, A+. The University of Utah invited him to come back and teach there, and he taught there until his death at age 55. I, of course, went from the stage of Stanley to the stage of the University of Utah in productions, and vocal workshop. I had a very beautiful voice and was studying to have a vocal career, attending a conservatory in Philadelphia, and I made an operatic debut in Baltimore, Maryland, singing in Hansel and Gretel. Then I had studies in Italy and loved the singing, but I didn't think a career in that situation would be very stable. And I loved teaching, so I returned to Salt Lake, where my parents had retired, attended the University of Utah, graduated with a BS in elementary education, taught for 21 years, fourth graders. And often in the summertime, after when we returned to school and talked about our summers, I would often tell them some of the stories of Stanley, and they couldn't believe that we could have fun without TV, games, and so forth. Then I married in 1961. We have one daughter, and my husband is an artist and was working for the UDOT here in Utah as an appraiser. So he too was involved with road building. Well, we had a wonderful life in Stanley, and I hope everybody enjoys the beauty of the earth and what it provides for you and is taken care of. Thank you for listening to my little story.